feeling guilty. But I just joined last night again. I renewed. I felt guilty to speak with you today without having rejoined the league. So
Ooh,
that's
I feel
done.
powerful.
Huh?
I said, I feel powerful.
Yeah. So you can give all the credit to Linda
Thanks.
and the other member of the new member committee who I've been sleeping with. But it is a pleasure. I have a real family feeling when I'm talking to the league. I have worked on and off with the league for most of the years that I've been back home, which is now over 15 years. And so I've worked with so many of you in different ways. Joanna and I work in so many ways right now, all the time. And we'll be working again in the upcoming mayoral and city council elections. And I'm so happy that all of us will be making our way down to Lincoln to testify on all of these issues before us. Tomorrow, I'm going to be taking an entire day to go down and testify before at least 3 hearings as it relates to voting rights, voting suppression. And so we've got lots of work to do. I want to, and you've asked me to speak on the history as it relates to Will Brown. Well, let me say that there are several ways in which to do that. And I have a way that I'm going to share knowledge on Will Brown. Not just the factual thises and that's, but the context. The context. As a matter of fact, I believe that all of history and all of the things that we learn and try to understand have to be put in context for you to have the deeper learning and provide you with deeper wisdom to facts. Now, one of the things about knowing the league for so long is that you all have known me before my hair turned gray. And that's sobering for both of us. But along the way, while my hair turned gray, I have reached a point in life where I provide the context and the wisdom of some of the historical facts around us and some of the things that we're doing now that may become history. The context of Will Brown has to be linked with the challenge of Will Brown. So allow me to share with you, as you see the backdrop of my Zoom, part of the context of Will Brown is captured in that photo of African Americans picking cotton. And while that is picking cotton, the context is that it was free labor. Free labor. Think about that. And so this country and the plantation owners who were able to provide a product to America did not have to pay for the labor to provide the product. That was quite an advantage. And so any story about Will Brown has to be put in context with what led up to Will Brown's travesty. It was slavery. And it was the 15th, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal in short words, and the 14th gave rights to all of us, regardless of color or ethnicity. And the 15th Amendment provided the voting rights for all, well, males, regardless of color. And what happened after that begins to set the stage for the context of Will Brown. What happened after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was a reconstruction period in the African American communities, predominantly in the South where we lived. And African Americans, after 1870, when that amendment was passed, registered and voted like crazy. And if you would go to the history books, you'll find that in the 1800s, post 1870, we had African Americans who were elected to Congress from the southern states and even the United States Senate. You may be surprised. We had dozens of African Americans in Congress in the 1800s. The Reconstruction period was met by a pushback because while not only the congressional elections, but the state houses and the local offices were held by African Americans. And the pushback looked like it was a pushback because of race. And partly it was, but the pushback was because of power, and privilege was taken from those who had those offices before we began to vote like crazy. The pushback is part of the context of Will Brown. And that pushback became to Jim Crow as we know it, where impediments to voting were installed in so many ways. Poll tax, grandfather clause, a literacy test, and jelly bean counting in jars, and grandfather clauses. And not only that, violence if you dared to want to register and vote. Jim Crow. And the result of Jim Crow is, before you knew it, over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, the Black elected official numbers fell off a cliff. The Jim Crow pushback was successful, and the power and privilege returned to those who use race as the mechanism. With all that, after 20, 30, 40 years, enough was enough. But right there, in the context of history, was the period that included the year 1919. Now, in Omaha, one might have to stop and pause and get a context for what had led up to 1919 in Omaha. Well, we have to back up a little bit and say that environment that I just described was so pervasive, racist, that in the early 1900s and the emergence of Jim Crow, blacks in the South began en masse, MASS, to migrate from the South to the North, partly to escape the racism of the South, but mainly to provide and find jobs and a way to live without the overlay of overt racism, but also to work and raise families. And so the migration from the South began to happen, and it surely happened to Omaha when African Americans came here to work in the packing houses. Wonderful, excellent, pretty good paying jobs. One little problem in Omaha, the same as the problem that I described in the South. Those wonderful jobs were coveted by white people living in Omaha before the blacks arrived. And so there was tremendous pushback with race being the lead, but what was behind it all was the jobs and the power in the jobs. And politically, at that time, we had political bosses, one in particular, Tom Dennison is his name, who controlled who had jobs and who ran the city hall. And he had a few stumbles. His choice for mayor at that particular juncture in time was not elected. And here come all of these blacks taking the jobs. He had a great way to organize his white supremacists back then. And so that was the context. So that in 1919, a white woman accused a black man of assaulting her in 1919, in the context of what all I've told you. And so they went out to find that person, not knowing who it was, but there was a guy, he lived in a house with another black man who had a white girlfriend. And so the wisdom of the thinking and agitated by the power said that house is probably where the guy is that assaulted this woman. And they went to that house and they got a man who lived there. His name was Will Brown. And they took him to jail. And the jail building, the courthouse, still there, same one that I see some of you in that building in traffic court, paying your fines, same building. But the power, the political, the privilege said, what an opportunity to rile up this crowd and dismiss the power of this false mayor and use this situation to rally the people behind the power that need be in this city. And so let's rile them up. And they did. And so 15 to 20,000 people surrounded that courthouse and demanded that Will Brown be released to the crowd. The authorities resisted. The mayor resisted. Well, they took the mayor and put a noose around his neck and hung him. Someone cut him down or he would have died. But that would have been good for the real purpose. And then, as the authorities continued to push back against releasing Will Brown, they set the courthouse on fire up to the point where the guards released Will Brown to the crowd. Will Brown. Don't forget the context. They took Will Brown, they shot him over 100 times. They hung him from a traffic or street pole, and they burnt him to a crisp and then dragged him through part of downtown. Will Brown. Oh, by the way, it turned out later that the lady who, oh, may I mention that Mr. Will Brown had rheumatoid arthritis and really was not capable of assaulting anyone. And may I mention that the woman who made the accusation admitted much later that it wasn't him. But the 20,000 people, ladies and gentlemen, in the context is so much like the people who climb the walls in our capital, driven by false information, false motivation, or sinister anarchy by a political boss, much like today, that context. And guess what? In the crowd were men and their wives and their children who they brought to see the spectacle. So the other part of the story is that the crowd was riled up and began to flow into North Omaha as we knew it. And that was easy. Do you know why? Because North Omaha was redlined. And the African Americans who lived in North Omaha lived in a boxed in, albeit figuratively, area that started around Cummings and went to about a half a mile north of Lake Street, not too much more west than 36th or 40th. If you were African American, you could not rent or buy outside that box. And if you found someone who would be so bold as to rent or sell you some place to live. The banks, the lending agencies wouldn't loan you the money. We were redlined and boxed, and so we were there all boxed in, so to speak. And that crowd found its way into North Omaha, riding through North Omaha and shooting guns, and our people tried to defend themselves and did. There were people that were killed after Will Brown's hanging. Oh, just a quick note that Will Brown's lynching was our second, not our first. In 1891, a fellow by the name of George Smith, AKA Joe Coe, was also accused of the similar assault, also was taken from the courthouse, and also was hung. And so I say to you that not only do we have the saga of Will Brown and the context, but we have the challenge of today because of Will Brown and because of Ed Poindexter, who I'm going to speak to you about on the 22nd, I believe. Stay tuned for that and the context of Ed Poindexter. At one time, about a year, 2 years ago, 2 years now, I felt in a cosmic sort of way that maybe Will Brown's death was going to be his death would serve to change things in our city, because we commemorated in 2019 the 100th commemoration of his death, and a group was formed to conduct ceremonies and so forth. But part of the group's name was the word reconciliation. And I felt that maybe this whole saga was God's way of laying the base and the root of respectful working conversations in 2020 and 2019 to reconcile not only the death of Will Brown, but reconcile the divisions and the racism that we find still around, and that Will Brown's life will have served in a strange way a step forward. That was my hope. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. Just like so many have signs in their window and words in their mouth that say Black Lives Matter. But the impact, the evidence of that feeling and statement and the signs are not there. There's no reconciliation and there's no change, healing, and reform. As we sit here in 2021, We've got divisions like I've never seen in my lifetime. And I'm older than everybody in the room, except, oh, never mind. We've got disparities and lack of investments. We've got Ed Poindexter. And tomorrow, I have to take a whole day off to fight for voting rights, to fight against voter ID, to fight against gerrymandering, and the fight for the right for the state not to have to do winner take all as it relates to electoral votes. We're still fighting those battles, and we haven't really got to the point of reconciliating all the way back from Will Brown's death and reconciliating ourselves right here in Nebraska. I'm writing an article for the Omaha World Herald. I just finished it. And the title is, "Where is democracy in Nebraska?" That I have to spend my day fighting battles to protect suppression. And so I challenge fellow members of the league is that we're going to have to take on the task, and we do, but even more so for truth, accountability, and action. And so someday, someone will put our actions in context and say, well, good job, my faithful servants. I thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Preston. We will now move over to Joanna Lindberg as we discuss how we move forward with this information in the story on an LWVGO standpoint in our GOTV team's initiatives, and then we'll move into Q&A and discussion if we have some questions for Preston. Joanna? Let's see here.
I think I got it in the video.
You're here.
Okay, Preston. We will be kind of crossing the interstate I'm doing it on Thursday and you're doing it on Wednesday for government committee.
Yes.
I will be going to the appropriations committee in Lincoln because of the Governor Ricketts bill to spend 230 million on a new facility.
Yes.
We have 10 prisons now and he wants an 11th prison. The league is taking a very strong position to oppose this bill. It's LB 383, and I've got some information if anybody'd like a copy of it, description of the bill. And it's so unnecessary. And, you know, the overrepresentation of minorities is a big red flag for our country. It's, you know, nationwide, although it is reducing. There is a really good article in the Sentencing Project that the overrepresentation is minimizing, but it's sort of the new way to enslave Blacks instead of without pay or with minimum pay. Our governor has a real strong desire for this facility, but statistics tell us it's not necessary. In 1980, our prison population was 1,400 individuals. And today it is 5,500, even though crime has reduced. So there are reasons why there are more people in prison, and it's been that tough on crime idea that people are dangerous and they need to be put away somewhere where they're locked up for good. And it is so counterproductive, because what we need is more community-based alternatives. Right now, the ACLU reports there are 1,000 prisoners who are eligible for parole but have not been released. Our parole board is really kind of frozen in time. They are not moving people off of their eligibility. They're not being released. I have several bills, or 7 bills right now, and I know there's more that would reduce overcrowding in corrections if they could pass. In the past, Governor Ricketts has vetoed these bills. And so it's going to take an override of his veto to stop these bills. But I could quickly tell you a little bit about them. Do you think there's time for that? And does this connect with the topic, Preston?
Well, let me say this. I don't have the authority to give you the more time, but I surely would vote for it. And I would also just add to it that part of the problem with the overcrowding and the need for the space, so to speak, for new buildings is that we're sending people to prison that don't need to go to prison.
Exactly.
The system is flowing people to prisons that don't need to be flowed to prisons. They're alternatives. Some knuckleheads, psychopaths need to have their little heinies in prison, but so many others have mental health problems, have drug problems, have all kinds of problems that can be dealt with externally from the prison and better. And so we need, it's a cycle that needs to be paused. That's the discussion. And the statistic that you may have will surely bear that out.
Definitely. And I would say we do have some time, Joanna, to discuss some of those bills, and then we'll go into some discussion further.
Okay, so
Thank you for taking that pressure off me on the time.
So the bill that I mentioned was to build the 1,500 bed facility for $230 million. That was LB 383. Then Senator Lathrop has a bill for a cost of $52 million. That would be 300 new beds, and that would be community corrections. I mean, it's not a bad bill, but the truth is, if we just closed the door on more prisons and forced our communities to come up with different solutions,
Right.
That's what the league feels is a better answer to the problem. You'll love this one. Senator Flood introduced a bill to have a judge in the trial announce what the cost of incarceration will be. So if Edward Poindexter was in front of a judge and they said it's going to cost $5 million to put him away for life, there might be different, it's public information, there might just be different solutions. If the other two that I think are critical, Lathrop has a early release for prisoners. And if they have, it's called that 2 years prior to their mandatory discharge date, they could be released. Or the other option, which is the current practice, if they serve half their sentence. Another one that I think is critical is prosecutor transparency. Prosecutors are the ones that sentence, or not sentence, but make the recommendation to judges for sentencing. And this bill, it's called the Prosecutorial Transparency Act, requires prosecutors to collect information relating to charging decisions, bonds, and case resolution, gender and ethnicity, and then provide that report to the legislature every year. It could and probably will provide information about trends and who we're incarcerating. Senator McCollister has a great bill that would require a mental health provider on the parole board, somebody that either knows mental health or CD, which would help be a much more informed representative on the parole board. Currently, there's 3 parole board members, and it's our governor, it's our Secretary of State, Bob Evenin, and our Nebraska Attorney General. And they are all conservative members of the Republican Party. So there's just little movement in the parole board, but yet they are in control of so many people's lives. McCollister has a bill that would, I mentioned that should have a mental health professional on that board rather than all elected members. Then McCollister would like to review the records of prisoners that have been in the prison for more than 30 years. Or if they are within 3 years of their earliest parole eligibility date, so that there's an ongoing stream of people going through and being reviewed. And it's definitely an incentive to do better in prison while you're there. Another incentive he's proposed, it's LB 624, would credit the social and pro activities, pro rehabilitative activities while you are in prison. You could earn credit to get out sooner. DeBoer then also asked for an annual report from corrections, parole, and probation, so that we again see what the trends are, the race, and would include where they're from and length of sentence, just kind of a visual that's not available currently. So those are the ones that the league is interested in, and we have a strong position against building prisons. And that's
Madam Host, may I just add
Yes.
that very good report, Joanna. Would expect nothing less from you. I want to verify that the Pardons Board is 3-member, governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General. They have a waiting list to get on the Pardons Board of 49. And they have a Pardons Board meeting when they want to, but it turns out it's about every 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes 2 or 3 months. And they see 4 or 5 per meeting. And so if you show up at the Pardons Board, you cannot get on the agenda unless you petition. And if you do, you become number 50. And Ed Poindexter, I'm giving a teaser for next week, is petitioning. We have been petitioning to get on the agenda. You can't be pardoned until you get on the agenda, and you can't get on the agenda till you get to the front of the line. And I argue even with that, because some people are in the line and they're in Baker's. When you go to a grocery store, somebody in Baker's is in the hopper to get on the Pardons Board because they want to have their record expunged. They're doing fine. They're living life. And they're taking up that space. And the governor says, we don't want to put anybody in the front of the line. And I tell the governor, what about somebody who's been in prison for 51 years and who is ill? And oops, you'll hear the rest next week.
Incredible. Thank you for that amazing teaser. I want to start our Q&A by just making a brief reflection. Something I was looking up, I did previously learn about Will Brown in school during sociology college courses, but the history is still shocking every time you hear it. And something that caught my eye during my research was this kind of highlighted statement. And I'll just say it just to spark questions or discussion. So one of the articles I read, it said, given the fuel provided by Tom Dennison and his allies, Brown may have been the victim of a politically inspired maneuver to restore the city's officials dislodged in the 1918 election. Brown's death was timely, if not timed, to provide an opportunity to strike hard at Mayor Ed Smith. Dennison's machine won the next election. And the reason I bring out this particular passage is because though we look at this history from 1918 from a perspective of we've made great strides and have moved towards amazing accomplishments for Black Americans, as well as anyone that fits within any person of color spectrum. However, or even, outside of that, we've just moved in great strides of equality. However, when you compare that to January 6th of 2021, how do you see the similarities, and how do you see that history hasn't changed so much and the script hasn't changed so much? It's just the people that have changed. And I think something that we should keep in mind, as Preston said, is how do we embark on this path of empowering people to stand up for democracy and being the speakers against insurrection and against people who feel like they can, take matters into their own hands. How do we, as people and believers in democracy and fair practices and, law and order, how do we make sure that though this seems, deranged, a lynching in 2021 would never happen, how does it translate to what we see here in 2021? How can we make sure that we are speaking up to make sure that it isn't a continuous pattern and people don't feel like this could happen again and again and again? But now I open up the conversation to Q&A. If you have a question, please, I invite you to unmute yourself to pose it or to send it into the chat. We are here to discuss and answer anything you have in mind.